All right, we have a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. First, I just want to say that we, over the last week, the network doubled in size, so we have twice as many nodes running, and we staked about 20% of the rev in circulation is backing the security of the network. So that's a huge win for the cooperative, and I want to congratulate everyone, the entire community, and all the people who worked so hard to pull it off. So I'm very happy about this this development. And speaking of development, Rao, are you ready to give the dev update?
Yes, I am. There's the link to the community update 133, and I'm going to share my screen with that update. So there was a lot of work done to get the get ready for the epoch change and make sure that the epoch change happens and the bonding unbonding occurs. So we have had since then a couple of minor releases. The test, the mainnet, all the nodes are now running 09.25.2. I spoke about 09.25.2 in the last session briefly, which was about these things to be fixed in here, right, if you see my screen. So improvements to the bonding and unbonding process, and we released them both in 09.25.1.1 and 09.25.2. And some security bugs. And then this review and improvement of the updates is separate, meaning it started, or we started listing them there based on what Scala Steward reports, but we're in the process of resolving them. That'll probably show up in the future releases. So that's where we are with the network right now. Both the testnet and the mainnet are all running 09.25.2, and I will briefly display what kind of fixes were there in 09.25.2. As you can see, these are some of the things to make sure that the synchrony constraint is acting upon only the active validators. This is something that as we moved from one epoch to the other, we realized that we needed to put that in there. And this is something, again, that's a security bug that's now fixed. The preventing deploys with the keys for blessed contracts. And then making sure that the post state hash is used by default for all for exploratory deploys. Those are some of the main ones. And then enabling per peer streaming queue on the outbound side. So those are some of the changes that went into 09.25.2. The main big or the main milestone that we are working towards is 09.26, which will have the completed last finalized state. And that right now is being tested. We should have, as long as we don't run into any issues, we should have it sometime next week, ready to be released. As we still have some tests to be written on 09.26, as well as running the existing tests and doing the fixes and changes as needed. That's where we are with the 09.26 release, but we're getting close to getting that completed. That's where we are. In last session, we did not do the tech governance meeting because we were busy with the epoch change and the post epoch change and making sure everybody got their rewards back and checking and double checking to make sure there are no accounting errors anywhere. So all that type of stuff. So that's what happened in tech governance. We are continuing to work on a bunch of initiatives to both speak to the business model and the validator economics and the economics of the token to support the network security and network decentralization. All of those are conversations in process. We are also beginning to look at running multiple nodes on a single machine, see how that goes, because we really, from a decentralization perspective, we want to get to a situation where anybody can run a node, in their basement or at work or wherever, where they have decent network connection to be able to decentralize the network. So that's something that's ongoing. It'll probably be a little while before we are comfortable saying, okay, this is what you can do from home. But that is certainly something we continue to focus on. So those are the main updates from my perspective. Are there any questions or comments on any of this? All right, over to you, Greg.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so, sorry. I have to turn off notifications quickly. So while I'm doing that, Daryl, do you want to do the community weekend review?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
Okay, so here is the weekend review for Thursday the 13th to today, Wednesday the 19th. On Thursday, in the governance committee call, the governance committee discussed reorganizing and nominating committee in order to evaluate board of director candidates and prep for the annual general meeting, and reviewed the procedures followed by the nominating committee in the previous year with a view to adapt to the process this year. In the DApp developer working group, testing locker.rho and log.rho and investigating issues with Visual Studio Code Rolang extension. On Friday, on the climate coordination call, we discussed the collapse of a Canadian ice shelf and the storms and flooding in Spain. We also discussed BP's shift away from fossil fuels due to shrinking demand and the blockchain's prospects to help humans with governance. On the Monday Casper stand-up call, Greg spoke to a correction in the quantum mechanics interpretation from a couple of weeks ago and extended the interpretation to include superpositions. On the blockchain art call, they did an evaluation of the Scuttlebutt decentralized chat. And yesterday on the RChain education call, they learned how to analyze RChain network operation using observable HQ. Also on Tuesday in the communications working group meeting, we discussed our Instagram and Facebook accounts. We also discussed the requirements for migrating RChain.coop site to GitHub pages and integrating a KPI dashboard on the homepage. Also on the Tuesday, the DApp developer working group developed a fix for Visual Studio Code Rolang extension. And this morning, just before this call, is the member hangout call. Ian brought up the tool from the education session in regards to creating dual RChain entities. Gary talked about robots Civ email filters and the Scuttlebutt protocol. Theo has been working on integrating IPFS for voting. And I discussed a new concept floating around that involves setting up a triangle of entities. And that's about it. So yeah, I just want to thank Jim, Steve Henley, Rao, Ian, Theo, Greg, Nora, and Gary for all their contributions to these recaps. And that's it for this week.
Thanks very much. Any questions for Rao or Daryl?
Yeah, regarding nominations for directors prior to the October 24th annual meeting, the deadline, according to the bylaws, is this coming Tuesday to say whether you're interested in becoming a nominee for directorship.
So please, 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 if you're interested, do step up. It's we've had a great team this year. And I think it's a fantastic opportunity to help the co-op grow and meet its goals. What's the item of business deadline?
Not sure just offhand.
Okay. All right. We should probably, so if you want items of business to be considered on the ballot for the AGM at the end of October, third week in October, please get those to the board right away. And then, so we also have been spending some time, so I'll go over this very briefly. We sort of need to curtail too much discussion about it in this forum, but we will have you'll sort of get your exposure to it in this forum if you didn't get it last Friday, and then we can talk about it in more detail in the Friday forum. And just to be aware, half of this presentation will be, I won't present that until Friday. So there's another half to this that speaks to Venus. So if you're interested in Venus development, Friday would be the session to join. So unless there's any questions or comments from the community, I want to talk a little bit about a model that we have been kicking around. So any questions or comments before we dive into that?
Just the answer to your question, the deadline to submit an item of business for the annual meeting is no later than 2 weeks before the annual meeting.
Okay.
That date is, the annual meeting is October 24th.
Okay, so is that October 11th? Is that right? Yeah, so that's rushing towards us. please get them in.
I think it's the 10th.
10th, okay.
So yeah, before the 11th.
Okay, so we are looking at an equity model to give people an option to invest in something that they can have a piece of, in addition to the token models that we've been using and will extend. Okay, so as we know, the internet is being refactored, right? So it's moving from centralized control by a few companies to decentralized applications serving decentralized communities. And obviously blockchain plays a big role in that. Of course, it's not the only force. Obviously, when the U.S. Congress calls the CEOs of the big four to testify, it means that there are other forces at work besides just technology and market forces. So this is a real thing. But even if we have these decentralized versions of these applications, and to do that requires a significant amount of reimagining those services. Even if we had a working prototype of a decentralized Facebook, there's a long way from a working prototype to a service that is run 24/7. So obviously, blockchains like RChain that have bet on high transaction volumes to keep the transaction fees down and still have the network be viable, they can't wait around for the community to just grow applications. I mean, it's great that we are seeing applications coming, but we have to be sort of in charge of our own destiny, and so the cooperative has to seed the space with applications, and it gets a twofer if it does that with applications that simultaneously fulfill organizational requirements like governance, right? That's sort of the reason to aggressively pursue chat and our vote, which we're delighted to see is largely community driven. But again, even if we had, well, I mean, and I should point out before going down that path, it's kind of important that these applications also provide templates for others to quickly develop applications. So the point with the Zulip is to make it so that we can demonstrate just how quickly you can start with an off-the-shelf tool like that and rapidly get to a decentralized version of the tool. And that acceleration is an important part of the way we're thinking about this this whole play. So what I said before, is really critical here, because even if it only takes us a few person weeks to get Zulip with an RChain backend and all of the sort of basic kinks worked out so that we have a functioning application, that's really not the same as a service that's running 24/7. So, for example, recently we've been seriously contemplating the endpoint that the exchange and the wallets use to access the network. Being aware of, like we've seen now for months, how they've used that endpoint. And so changing the API a little bit to help them out, it might initially upset their code. And so if the same is true for any dApp that's running on top of the platform. If the protocol changes or an endpoint API changes, who's going to be there to make sure that the dApp, some feature in the dApp doesn't degrade or cease to function? Likewise, if an observer node goes down or any of a number of other things change, who's going to be there to make sure that the dApp is still running? Who's going to make sure that there are bugs shaken out of existing features? Who's going to make sure that there are new features coming because the requirements that show up through long-term or large-scale usage? Who's going to make sure that those features get developed? So that's a separate set of capabilities that needs to be monetized. And what we've seen is that software as a service is a very viable model. Red Hat, MySQL, and many others are examples of this as a very convincing model. What's different, though, is that with RChain, we have this ability to kind of cookie cutter stamp out a lot of these services. And so that's that means that a much smaller team, like a team of 10, can run 10 or more of these services. So that's what is one of the things that might make an organization that does that kind of thing more scalable and therefore more profitable. So this is the kind of picture that's emerging. First, let me speak a little bit to the right-hand corner of the triangle. Can everybody see this? Is this big enough?
Yep.
Cool. So there's been a lot of discussion, debate, dialogue around whether RChain is a worker co-op or a consumer co-op. I think there's been a lot of push within the dev side of the community to have RChain be more like a worker co-op. And so, you know, I mean, there are strong business reasons why we need a consumer co-op. But I can certainly understand why not make a worker co-op as well. So the thought is to just go ahead and do that, and then the various members of the community that have wanted a worker co-op, they can participate in that worker co-op. So if there are members of Collab who would want to use that infrastructure, you know, to begin to monetize some of their efforts, you know, others in the community might use that, and that gives them a legal framework so that they can address some of the legal risks that are associated with providing code to various parties. And there's a built-in customer in the form of RChain cooperative that might toss over the wall specifications, designs, and early prototypes, and then, you know, suggest that they be taken the next step. But then at the top of the triangle, we have, and again, these names are not fixed. I'm just using them as placeholders. We have what we've been calling RSaaS, this is a shop which is doing software as a service. So you can think of, you know, the co-op sees a need like our vote or our chat, and throws out some specs and some designs, possibly even some early prototypes. Our dev takes that the next step, and then to an MVP, and then that MVP is taken up by RSaaS and run as a service and developed over time into something that is usable on a 24/7 basis. And of course, during that course, that may produce additional requirements for the platform, right? So as they're running the service, they say, well, it would be really nice if the core protocol did this, that, or the other thing. It would make our lives easier. So that's an output. That's another kind of output that comes out of RSaaS. So Rao had a really nice observation. You can think of RDev as kind of a builder, you know, in the domain of properties, you know, housing and office space and that kind of thing. You can think of RDev as like a builder contractor, and RSaaS is like the property management. So that's one way to think about it. There's an IP issue that has to be addressed. So in particular, if the co-op comes up with some designs and RDev takes those designs to an MVP, then both of those parties should get a small slice of the revenue stream that comes out of that service. And then RSaaS is only going to take services on the basis of a metric that looks at the number of seats that you might see in that service and the number of click-to-pay events per annum per seat over the operational cost of that. So that's so if you have RChat, then there has to be somewhere in that some kind of tokenization or other kind of click-to-pay events that generate you know, steady revenue streams before RSaaS would be willing to pick it up as a service. A small but very important point is RSaaS does not have to be, you know, beholden or bound to RChain. It can be working with other chains as well, you know, such as Cardano or Ethereum, Elrond, who knows, whatever smart contracting services actually make sense to build. Smart contracting chains actually make sense to build services on top of. And as such, for each of these core protocols that it's got services running on, it's going to need a cache of tokens to run those services. So as a hedge, it makes sense for RSaaS to have a token that service users can use, and it on the back end does all of the market management to make sure that those services perform as desired. So, for example, if RChat were to offer tokenization, so the data lives on RChain, and there's some tokenization behavior that lives on RChain, and some other tokenization behavior that lives on Ethereum. For example, there's some things that you can do that run smart contracts on Ethereum. Then the RChain would RSAS would issue a token that is used by end users to drive the service, and then on the back end, it sort of turns that token into the right mix of Rev and Ether. And so there's a token management play here as well. And then RSAS has a built-in market for these services in terms of the co-op, and the co-op is already motivated to do community development, to expand its user base, its membership, but it works the other way as well. So as more services come online, then that also drives people to the co-op. So it's a kind of win-win for both parties. So what we're suggesting is that the current SPV morph into RSAS, and that SPV is now wholly owned as an organization by RChain Cooperative. And then as people purchase equity in this instrument, in this company, then the control moves outward from RChain. We don't believe that it's necessary for RChain to own or have complete ownership of that for its lifetime, but it's probably a right balance for that. So does that make sense? Any questions, comments?
Greg, I think the introduction of another token probably introduces a lot more friction than it does anything else. And I would also think that from the SaaS perspective, there's probably a lot of potential corporate users that don't want to touch tokens or can't touch tokens, but and may not necessarily have what you would call click-to-pay events, but that want to integrate various blockchain technologies or attempt to integrate them into their stacks. And I think it's what you described. While it makes other than the token makes sense, I think it's looking at it from a retail perspective and not from like a centralized entities wanting to use this platform, which is then going to bring value, and then inevitably flywheel effect. Maybe retail follows. If I was a Fortune 500 and I said, hey, I want to integrate RChain technology, and maybe I'm going to start off with some type of permission shard or something. There's no click-to-pay events. Are we saying that the SaaS team's not going to work with them?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. So there may be an elaboration of the metric, but these are all great comments and great questions. So let's have a vigorous conversation about this on Friday, and just informational questions now. And then I think Rao is setting up a time for you and Rao and I to have a much more detailed conversation. So all of these are great comments, and I really appreciate it. Any other informational questions or comments?
Well, ideally, I think we would want there to be lots of different RDevs and RSASs out there. And I'm just a little curious, why brand these things under the same branding as the co-op? If we want to demonstrate that any organization can come in and pick up the code and start building applications and hosting and providing.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I don't think that the R necessarily attaches it to RChain. right? It's not like we said RChain developers or RChain software as a service. Just the R is just a designation. And it can talk more about origin rather than specific affiliation.
Right, but
And
I mean,
really-
Yeah, I guess there are a couple of points here. I mean, Daryl, for example, was saying the R is more like our, as in the co-op.
Yes.
But the point of these organizations is really to have something that would jumpstart transaction volume on the network, and increase the financial security and hence the overall usability, security, growth of the network and decentralization. It doesn't mean that there cannot be 100 other organizations also doing something similar, right? So there is not, this is more, think of that more as a jumpstart vehicle, so that then people can be inspired to, because the developer ecosystem is a chicken and egg situation. People won't start doing things unless they know that, okay, this is going someplace. So this is a way to demonstrate that the protocol and the network is going someplace, going to a good place, so that others can then be motivated to do their things. At least that's how I'm personally viewing that. I'm not sure if Greg agrees with that or not, but
no, I very much agree. I very much agree. I mean, it's one thing to say that we want a lot of these organizations, but until there's at least one, people don't do it, right? So we need, just like, there's been a lot of hue and cry, oh, we really want a workers' co-op, and we've suggested, well, hey, just make one, but people won't do that, right? So if we make one, then people can participate in it and get the benefits of the legal defrayment of risk.
So the co-op's role then is to jumpstart these things and to encourage them to be as open and non-proprietary and as exemplary a model as possible, so others can come in and copy it. And then also for the co-op to get out from these jump-started businesses as well, to maintain.
I mean, once you are inviting investors into it, whether what does co-op getting out mean? That means co-op basically giving up full control to the outside parties is basically what it means. But I mean, also keep in mind that this ecosystem development is not a either well understood or well defined process. So there will always be questions coming up for us to have to resolve, to say, okay, how should this be configured? Some situation will arise where we have to make a decision as to say, does the co-op have anything to say about it, and what do they want to say if they do have something to say about it? So that kind of experience you won't have in the organization unless you are also running something like this. Sort of thinking of it as if a large enterprise is running an inside innovation center or a venture center, they're more equipped to deal with ventures coming from outside and what to do and how to do and all that kind of stuff. So this is similar to that, in that we have a lab, if you would, that not only for technologies, but also for organizational practices and conflict resolution, and how do we make sure that the competition is healthy and helps the growth of the network, as opposed to leading towards more centralization and more takeover of the network, that kind of behavior. So there are a lot of benefits to working with something like this, to identify the issues ahead of time and then say, okay, well, here are 2 or 3 different ways to resolve those issues. At least I see that as one of the benefits to doing something like this. Otherwise, you basically are leaving it for whoever, either with the money or control or whatever, to take it over. And as an open source, that is always a possibility. Anybody can do their own version of it. So we're not expecting that somehow having this is restricting anybody from running their own models. But it's more that having this kind of an organization helps us identify, debate, and resolve issues around the conflicts and mutual synergies, and how do we optimize the synergies and things like that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm in 100% agreement. You know, and until you have such a thing, you know, we can say, well, you know, there should be lots of them, but there has to be at least one. um, and you know, and to a certain extent, we will have failed if you know, our SaaS builds all of its services on some other chain, right? That won't help the co-op from the point of view of generating transaction volume. So we have to execute as RChain cooperative. We have to execute in such a way that it's very beneficial for our SaaS to build on RChain, right? There's a good solid reason to do that.
I think like another analogy that could be played here is another co-op that I worked for, Mountain Equipment Co-op here in Canada, very much like REI. We made our own products. So we had the MEC brand, Mountain Equipment Co-op brand, and you know, we built, I think, some of the best outdoor clothing ever made. You know, like I think we did a really amazing job at it. We had an R&D department, and a guy developed a type of clip that is widely used on other products now. So to me, I see it kind of similar to that, where we were a store, we sold Mountain Equipment Co-op products, but we also sold Helly Hansen and all sorts of other companies' products as well. And it's still going strong.
Yeah, you know, Daryl, your comments about, you know, because you had said you wanted to do a kind of music streaming cooperative, and your comments were, when we walked it through the model, I thought they were helpful and clarifying. So when you so you as a client of this ecosystem, you might come in and say, well, you know, I have some ideas about what I want this thing to do and how I want it to look as a music sharing service. And so you could go to RDev and say, hey, can you make me, you know, I've got so many K to put together an MVP, and they bid on that, and assuming they win the bid for your dollars, they put together an MVP. And then with that MVP, you move along to our SaaS and you say, all right, well, here's an MVP for a service, right? This is my click to pay model. This is my economic considerations. I'd like to buy your services for a year to have this streaming service be operational for at least a year. And they take on that contract and keep it running for at least that amount of time. And there may be a back and forth where they give you some guidance about your economic model. Say, well, what we found from these other services, that this tokenization is better than that tokenization. And you might take that feedback back to our dev and say, hey, can we modify the MVP a little bit like this? They do that, and then you toss it over to our SaaS, and then they make it run as a service. I thought that was when we walked it through like that, you know, I thought it was very edifying and clarifying. Does that picture still make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is the path that I need to do what I want to do. So, you know, it excites me greatly. It actually helps me think that, hey, you know, maybe I don't need to generate $2 million to start this startup. Maybe if I came up with like 50 grand or maybe a couple hundred grand, you know, I could hire some developers from RDev and, you know, get the ball rolling with it. So it kind of gives me like, as someone who wants to build dApps on RChain, it gives me this kind of easier thought about how I could get started and get going with it.
Mm. Yeah,
and I think
the
importance of tokens is that they're tickets to use your product, and you can create 1,000 tokens, and then if people believe in your products, they'll buy the tokens. So that's the other side of the token. I think they're necessary.
I would just say with tokens in general, I mean, I'm not an anti-token person, but I do think at times they're overused. But I would also say that even when they're used appropriately, you have to consider things such as ensuring that there's systemic liquidity available so that you don't have to have a human person in the middle exchanging these tokens. You need to make sure there's an active, deep book of liquidity on both the buy and sell side. You need automated execution. I don't know if that's bonding curves or whatever it may be. There's a lot of friction with tokens, even ones that are appropriate, that needs to be taken into consideration. You then also have a lot of people that are not crypto native, which is inevitably needed to come into the ecosystem if we're going to have Visa level transaction demand, that either can't touch tokens, don't want to touch tokens, whatever it may be. And so there's a lot of considerations out there. Not saying tokens are bad.
Yeah, you can always say they can always be play tokens. You know, they're just an accounting tool.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, these are really important questions. I mean, the more tokens you have, the more difficult it is for a user to wander through your space, right? This is something I thought a lot about when we were thinking about our song. Was, you know, it makes sense for certain artists to have their own token, but it does not make sense for every artist to have their own token, because then you got, you know, 10 million tokens and you know, exchanging amongst them to get to the artist services that you want is a nightmare and a headache. You know, it's not easy. It's now much more challenging. So there's some sweet spot somewhere in there, but finding out what that is difficult. Yeah.
Well, you know, your wallet needs to pay for things in the tokens you don't want and sell them in for the tokens they want.
Yeah.
I would just say that like every single token that is created inevitably needs to have a sustainable economy of its own, and inevitably creating more tokens in and of itself does not necessarily create more value. And hence, if you're spreading value out amongst more tokens, especially if the aggregate value is still early and in question, you may actually be sabotaging the whole, whatever it is that's being built, sabotaging any one from getting to any type of critical mass of value, which then attracts liquidity or attracts network effect.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, if you create more tokens, then there is demand for your product. You know, you're not going to be liquid. So if you're providing a service that people want and are willing to pay for in advance, then you can go.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of interesting discussion and debate, and I think it's really important to look at it from multiple angles before fire, because at this point it's very easy to mint tokens. It's too easy. So yeah, it's definitely worth thinking this through from every angle that we can think of. And I really enjoy the vigorous discussion. It's great to see so much energy in the community debriefs. All right, well, unless there's any other informational questions or comments about the thoughts that we're having right now, we have time slotted on Friday for a much more in-depth talk, and also talk about how this fits into Venus. So looking forward to having that conversation. Any other questions or comments from the community before we sign out?
I have one thought. About 15 minutes or so ago, we were talking about the R part of the RChain brand and what the R means and all that. The way that I look at it is that RChain is the brand, and the R is the philosophy or the why of RChain. So when I think about, you know, these kind of like placeholder names that we're giving for these different ideas here, like R SaaS and R Dev and R Song, you know, they're probably not going to be the actual names of these entities, but it helps me with the philosophy that it's a new form of capitalism we're building here. It's shared ownership, and that's what excites me. So I just wanted to kind of lay that down right now.
I love it. That is exactly right. You know, it's this highly compressed way of talking about that. I don't want to say ideology, but that particular worldview.
Yeah, well, I think, philosophy, I think, and again, connecting to the why of why we're doing all this. It's like, when I think of hour in front of these things, it like you say, it's just high impact. It quickly gets the point across, and it helps maintain that focus.
Yes, indeed, indeed.
And so as we start to kind of solicit the traditional top-down business model, right, we're trying to solicit that mentality here, right, with the SPV. So, as we do that, we're always consciously aware that we're wearing the pants.
I love it.
But we're decentralizing. We're creating a sociocratic polyarchy.
Indeed. Awesome. That's a great note to end on. Thanks to all. I really appreciate the hard work, and I'm glad to see that we're on an upward path. I would strongly encourage those in the community of female persuasion to consider a board seat. The board could use more estrogen. So please consider running for a board seat. All right. Thanks to all. Talk to you soon.